afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining this session of Help You Forum. Yes, today's session is Teaching Creatively in IR 4.0. Our panel members for today are Professor Dr. Sue Jennings and Professor Dr. Andy Hickson. So just a short background on what they do. So Dr. Sue Jennings is the pioneer of drama therapy around the world. She is a play therapist, neurodramatic play artist, and author of over 50 published books. And Dr. Andy Hickson is the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Communication at Help University. He is a creative arts practitioner, actor, director, and published author. I would like to warmly remind everyone to mute your mics and turn off your video cameras if you are not the presenter or speaker for this talk. At the end of this talk, there will be a Q&A session that will last for about 15 minutes. You may enter your questions into the chat box. Right. Take the stage, Dr. Andy and Dr. Sue Jennings.
Thank you, Farah, for that warm introduction, and hello to everybody in Malaysia and Southeast Asia. Good afternoon, and good morning to all of those of you in Europe, and particularly my co-presenter today, my mother, Dr. Sue Jennings, who is beaming in from the UK. Today's talk is about creative online teaching and learning. I'm going to give a brief introduction, and then Dr. Sue and myself will pass between each other. You will not see a PowerPoint presentation. We're not providing you with any visuals on the screen. It's just going to be the two of us. And then, as has already been mentioned, at the end, you will be given a chance to ask us any questions that you wish. So, online teaching and learning. When we are teaching online or learning online, one of the things that we have lost is this sense of physical presence. But thinking outside the box, I'd like you to imagine the blind person. The blind person, having lost their sight, over time develops their other senses more acutely. And so must the online educator. We might have lost this sense of physical presence, but that doesn't mean that we can't develop our other senses. People need to see you with their eyes. You can develop your voice. You can develop your tone, your articulation, the sound of your voice, the pace, and a whole lot more. In addition to your voice, you've got all these other tools, your body language, your facial expressions, your visuals, your surroundings, infographics, props, color, sound, music, stories, performances, and so on. One of the dangers, I believe, when particularly teaching online, is that people tend, when they sort of feel they're hiding behind this screen, is that they create a script and then they read from the script. You have already lost one of your connectors. If I had a script here and I started reading from it, already I've lost eye contact with you, or you've lost eye contact with me. Much better to know your stuff, know your subject area, or learn your script. People need to see your eyes. It's one of the key connectors in learning and educating online. You don't have to have a physical connection, but you do actually have a connection with your eye contact. Now, if people are serious about developing effective online education, then you need to work on developing your key tools of delivery. I'd now like to pass over to Dr. Sue.
Right. Communication doesn't always have to be verbal, does it? Now, probably that's one of the few times you've ever seen bubbles at the beginning of a talk. What am I doing? I'm trying to take you by surprise. If I can take you by surprise, you might just start to think about what I could be saying. And I think many of us long to be more creative in our communication, in our teaching, in our interactions, but all sorts of things stand in that way and try to block us. This is what I call time for Max the monster to intervene here. Now, Max the monster sits on my shoulder, and if I get stuck, then Max the monster's saying, now who says you can't do that? Who says you should do this? Who says, why haven't you done something else? And all of us carry around with us on both our shoulders admonitions from our childhood to do with expectations of other people rather than choices for ourselves. And have a think while we're talking together, Andy and myself, about what stands in our way. What little voices nag at us to say, actually, you shouldn't be doing that, you should be doing this. Obviously, in education, we're teaching facts, but we're also teaching experience. We're inviting people to go away and experience something for themselves and see what they come up with. I think one of the most heartening things I've been witnessing recently is the new science program for younger children, where one of our top scientists has become very computer savvy, very communicative, and can actually teach large groups of children primary scientific principles. And they remember them because they've been taught in a creative and interactive way. So our facts remain. We are teaching principles, logic, theory about certain things, whatever subject we're in. And people that think that the arts are a soft option, there is as much theory underlying all of the arts as there is in any scientific subject we care to mention. The arts are not just an airy-fairy luxury activity that we do after school, or when we were young, our mothers paid for in the evenings. New research on our brains has shown that a creative and artistic approach underpins effective teaching and learning. It started off many years ago with the Russian psychologist Vygotsky. And Vygotsky did a very simple little experiment. He had a picture that he was going to show 3 classes of children. And in the first class, he just had the picture hanging in the classroom, didn't refer to it, but it was there. With the second class, the picture was in the room and they talked about the picture and discussed it. And in the third class, they had the picture, they discussed it, but then they enacted the major themes in the picture. They created a drama about them. When he went back 3 months later, we could actually predict that the class that remembered the picture most in more detail and in greater depth were the ones that had enacted it. So there's something about experiencing something physically, vocally, sensorially, that helps us to understand, learn, and to recall. And I think this whole body approach to learning, which is what we can learn through drama, music, art, and dance, is very important for us to remember.
And can be carried online as well.
Absolutely.
So it's not only can we utilize these creative activities within an online space, creative activities are skills for life. Essentially, one of the key things, apart from knowing which tools to practice and utilize, like our eye contact with our audience, we need to develop, and we can do this with creative and artistic education, our overall communication skills. Now, I've already mentioned the voice. We've all got a voice, but we all use it in different ways. Many of us aspire to having a voice like a famous actor. A lot of people are unaware that it is actually possible to develop and train our voices to actually speak like the actors we really like. I'm going to try a little exercise with everybody here. I'm not going to ask you to turn on all your cameras. I'll trust that you're going to do this, okay? Now, one of the little unknown things about the voice is the most important thing is our breath, our breathing. In fact, the breath is the power behind our voices. So I'm just going to do a little experiment with you all. What I'd like you to do after I count to 3 is I want you to all hold your breath, and then while holding your breath, I'd like you just to say the word hello, okay? So hold your breath, don't let go of your breath, try and say the word hello, and then we'll see what happens. 1, 2, 3, hold your breath,
Hello.
and now say hello. It's not possible. As I'm sure you found out, maybe 1 or 2 of you cheated, went hello, or something like that. But actually, the breath is the power behind our voice. The voice or the sounds are made from the breath hitting our vocal cords. Okay, those bits of tissue in our throats. And it sends out vibrations, sounds. And what happens to these sounds, how we form them into words, is by using our vocal apparatuses, our lips, our tongues, our palates, and so on. Okay, so the onus on us when we are trying to find creative ways to teach online is, first of all, we need to develop some of the essential skills that we already have, some of the essential skills like our voice, and build on it. Not only do we need to think about skills like our voices, but we also need to think about, and I'm going to take a side step here, we need to think about our equipment. We need to make sure we've got a relatively reasonable microphone. We need to make sure we've got a relatively reasonable camera. Obviously, the more funds we have at our disposal, the better we can make our cameras and our microphones. But I'm just using a simple webcam built into my laptop along with the mic. So you don't need to spend a lot of money. But think about how you use the equipment, how you use the space. Think of, for example, one key thing to remember is the rule of thirds. You'll notice that I'm taking up roughly a third of the space within this frame that I'm setting, within this Microsoft Teams frame. To one side of me, there are some flowers, got some leaves. Another side of me, there's some books and one of my friends, Louis the puppet. So I've framed the situation. How many times have you been on Teams or Zoom or one of the online platforms, and all you see is the presenter's head? Or you see the presenter going right up to the screen and you get a magnified view of their nostrils and their nostril hair. rehearse a little bit beforehand, get a friend to check out what the screen's going to look like, and already your online delivery and the potential for online learning with your students, with your participants, is going to be greatly increased. Anything you'd like to add, Sue?
Yes, it was very important, I think, Andy, that you raised the issue about breath being the power. And we actually use the minimal amount of breath that we could do. That if we actually practice deep breathing exercises, which you can find them online, you can find them in voice books for actors, voice books for giving confidence. It's a way of being able to expand the muscles in between our ribs. And I just ask you all just to feel those muscles for a minute. In between your ribs is a series of muscles. Now breathe in. Now those muscles expand, and blow it out again, and they go down. So it's not your ribs that expand, it is your rib cage that expands, rather like bellows. And if you practice your deep breathing just for a few minutes every day, you can increase your capacity to hold your breath, which means you've got more breath to talk with, to proclaim with, to raise your voice, to lower your voice, to vary it in different ways. Just one little warning, don't try and do that too quickly, because if you do it overnight, your rib muscles will be extremely sore and you'll wish you hadn't tried it. A little bit at a time, expanding and decreasing.
Incremental steps.
Absolutely. And once you've done that, you will find that your voice itself has much more power. And not to forget that when we're delivering a talk or making a point or raising an issue, there's great power in pausing, of just waiting that moment. I mean, people that do these prize giving shows on television have got it down to a fine art, where they tell you, and the winner is, and they'll wait, and everyone's on the edge of their seat.
Suspense.
So the power of pause and the power of vocal variety, of not always talking on a monotone. Just think for a minute. Go back to when you were at primary school and early secondary school. Which teachers did you find you listened to, and which teachers did you just switch off from? And it wasn't always the subject matter, it was the way they delivered it. We can learn from that. We don't need to repeat what they did. And I think at the end of the day, as teachers and educators and as learners, we need to decide what is the most important thing to take away from this talk. Never try to cram it with more than 3 important issues. There might be lots of little sub-issues, but there should never be more than 3 very important points to take away from a talk.
That's very important.
Because otherwise we bury it in lots of detail surrounding it, and we literally can't see the wood for the trees. So what are your 3 most important trees in everything you're trying to teach?
I love that metaphor of the tree and growth, and also linking back to one of the things you mentioned earlier, Sue. You brought up one of the great educators of our time, Vygotsky. There have been many, Dewey, for example, and Montessori, Piaget, and so on. Now, just because they are, some would regard ancient, doesn't mean that even today their concepts, their research doesn't stand up. It does stand up. And there's no point, I think, in reinventing the wheel. They made some extremely valid points for for traditional face-to-face education, which is just as important to online education. And I think one of the key things that we've briefly touched upon that I think is worth mentioning here is this idea of interaction. It's finding a way to interact with your students, interact with your audience. Don't just be the kind of lecturer, kind of teacher that thinks they know everything and just spews it all out. You want to find a way to interact with them. They don't just want to listen to your voice or watch your PowerPoint presentation for the whole of your lesson. Okay, so do make use of interaction methods. We've talked about some of the equipment that we need to make use of and be careful of and prepare beforehand. We've talked about some of the developmental skills like our voice and our eye contact and body language that we need to build, be aware of and practice. But there are also a lot of other interactive skills that we can make use of that we might not even have thought of. Techniques like making people laugh. I'm wondering, Sue, how many people had a laugh when you were blowing your bubbles? Giving people activities that they can engage in, that they can undertake. Now, for example, I don't know if any of my students are watching, but what I often do when I'm working with them is I like to, even though we're learning online together, is I like to split them up into groups, smaller groups or into pairs. Now, one of the techniques that I use to do this is that we might be, for example, as we are now, using Microsoft Teams, or we might be using Zoom or some platform like that. At the same time, on my mobile phone, I will be logged into WhatsApp or Messenger. There's a lot of applications or apps that you can choose from. Now, I will have already set up a group for my class within WhatsApp so that in addition to what we are learning or teaching online on the Zoom or the Microsoft Teams platform, we can also be doing subgroup work using different devices. So for example, really simply, I might set them a task. I'd say, right, now I'd like you to find a partner. WhatsApp is very good for this because you can, in pairs, you can see each other much like you do a video call if you're speaking to somebody. Set them a task, get them to share with each other on WhatsApp, and then they would come back to the group, back to Teams or Zoom, and we would then share and mind map and discuss as a group. So don't think just because you're online that you can't do a lot of the things that you would be doing if you were in a traditional face-to-face setting. Now, I personally don't particularly like in any setting PowerPoint presentations. I think they are very old school. Now, I know a lot of people still make use of them. Occasionally I do. I like to, one of my favorite alternatives, although it's quite difficult here, to a PowerPoint presentation that I've seen used is at dance. So I know one lecturer that instead of presenting his ideas on PowerPoint or in visuals, he has a troupe of dancers that will enact behind him or with surrounding him some of the ideas that he's presenting. Fantastic. It's very dynamic, it's very creative. It makes it more interesting. And one of the key things that you're doing here with your audience, with your participants, just like the example that Sue quoted earlier with Vygotsky in the painting, is you are stimulating their imagination. Remember that that's another tool that you can use, is your students' imagination. You can get them imagining things within your lesson, within your lecture? I'll pass back to Dr. Sue. I think she wants to follow up on that.
Absolutely. Because it immediately brings up that whole area, Andy, of our brain hemispheres and what things belong to different parts of the brain, and how if certain parts of the brain are activated, we won't learn. So, for example, a student with very high anxiety or a teacher with very high anxiety, if that anxiety and the fears associated with it aren't dealt with, they will find learning extremely difficult because stuff doesn't go in. There is something in that part of the brain called the amygdala, which will stop new information going in. It will do all it can to keep it out and will provoke responses such as fighting or running away or just freezing. But if we can activate those parts of the brain, particularly in the right hemisphere, which are to do with creativity, to do with spontaneity, to do with intuition, to do with artistic and creative work, to do with empathy, very important. These things will promote a much wider sphere of learning. And it's interesting too that the right hemisphere of the brain is also to do with groups and responds to groups of people, whereas the left hemisphere of the brain, which we also need to do with logic and facts, is much more individually based. So in any learning, I think we need to try and get a balance between the right hemisphere and the creativity and the left hemisphere and the factual learning. I think those are really, really important. But unfortunately, Western systems of education are almost all left hemisphere based. And I know of one country that I won't actually name because I don't want to feel I'm shaming anybody or any district. But the significance for this particular country of being a good pupil was to write down everything the teacher said, and then when with the exam at the end of the term, you just copied it out again as your exam answer, the exact words that the teacher had said in the class. And that was the way to be a high achiever and to get good jobs. And you go to job where bosses expected you to repeat the actual things that they had said. Now compare this with a different approach. And again, this is us challenging everyday values. They did a very interesting bit of research. They matched two firms that had similar number of employees, similar productions, and so on. And with one firm, the bosses, assistant bosses, and so on arrived in the morning and just went straight to their offices and got on with their work. With the other one, when the bosses arrived, they stopped to say hello to people. They maybe touched them on the shoulder, saying, "How are you today?" And somebody else, "Oh, I hear things have been a little ill at home." The production from these two firms doubled in the one where the bosses took those few moments to pay attention to the workers, compared with where they paid no attention to the workers. So again, we can see this in education, that we don't refer to a class en masse as the class, that we don't shame people who actually are struggling. We don't always know whether there are impediments to learning, whether there are old fears and anxieties, even spectrum disorders and so on. So it's a way of staying positive, but also without being indulgent. People don't like it if they're patronized. Okay? So it's a question of being inclusive and encouraging and not getting into the games of blaming and shaming and holding people up to ridicule. I feel very strongly about these qualities. If we're going to be good educators, then we know how to encourage and support. We know the carrots, we don't use the sticks.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, unlike this unnamed country that you mentioned, is one of the things they're not doing by getting their students to learn by rote and just sort of regurgitate facts that the teacher has fed them, is you're not, as you said, developing the creativity, but you're also not developing any kind of critical thinking, any kind of critical thought, because the teacher, the lecturer, the guide is not always right. And in fact, it's not only a question of right and wrong sometimes, there are many perspectives to different situations, to different stories, even facts in certain situations can work in different ways. And I think one of the things, and we need to keep doing this with online education, is we need to further develop our students' critical thinking skills. We need to find ways for them to sort of relax their fears. You mentioned authority earlier on. It's being able to speak to somebody that's maybe their elder, or maybe they've got a title that they haven't got, or maybe they feel they've got more qualifications, and so you're shy about asking a question. If you foster Q&A within your lectures, then over time, when students feel comfortable that they're not going to be reprimanded for saying something that disagrees with what you're saying, then more and more students are going to be able to ask those questions. One of the techniques, and I'm not going to do it with all of you now, but one of the techniques I often use when I'm working with a new class that don't know me and don't know that I like them to ask questions, so they have this fear of asking a question, that they might be saying the wrong thing, or they might be contradicting me, or they might upset me, or whatever the reason is that they don't want to ask the question, is I will, like I mentioned earlier, I'll split them up into pairs. So I'll get them working in pairs, and one of my favourite ways is to, right, what I want you to say to your partner is I want you to tell them the question that you might have asked, and then to get the other partner to tell you the question that they might have asked. So they listened to each other's questions. So they felt comfortable, because very often they're telling one of their classmates or even one of their friends. And then after a few minutes of this sort of sharing, I'll bring the whole group back together, and I will then start identifying people. Now, the first person that I ask, I'll say, so what's your friend's question? What's your teammate's question? And they'll go, I said, no, don't worry, it's not your question. You're not going to feel silly for saying the wrong thing, because it's not your idea in the first place. So it doesn't matter what you say, it's not going to reflect badly on you. And then they realise that they've been given some kind of freedom. And they ask the question that their friend has told to them. And then when they see that I give them a reasonable answer, and I don't tell them that's a silly question, whatever the question is, even if I did think it was a bit silly, then the courage amongst the rest of the group starts to build. And when I work with the same group over and over again, when they've seen how I've dealt with the initial questions, they are a lot more confident. But there's many other techniques. Sue will tell you many. I'm going to reach over here to one of my favourite little friends. This is Al. Say hello. Hello. Twit-twoo. I know, owls don't go twit-twoo. Anyway, I could get my owl to ask a question. Now that somehow releases people from the burden of having asked the question themselves, because it's not them, it's their puppet that's asked the question. So another tool, another creative way of dealing with your students, with your audience. Did you want to add to anything there, Sue?
I did. I was just going to say that the using the puppet to start it off, to do like a warm up of questioning, and letting the puppet have different voices. You know, the puppet could whisper in your ear because it's shy, or it could bawl out a question in quite a confrontational way. And you would then be demonstrating, well, how do we deal with that if somebody really wants to be extremely confrontational and wants to dominate the conversation? And I think another giveaway that we come across in interactions is when people start to talk about people like us believe or do or think that somehow there is a group of people that hold exactly the same views and therefore we mustn't challenge it. And that often occurs in families very early on. You know, people like us, dear, don't really do that. And it's really interesting how early on that gets inculcated. And those of us involved in subjects like social psychology and anthropology and those really have to challenge that in the kindest possible way, but to really prick this bubble of sort of exclusivity and somehow elitism and therefore privilege. Feeding that back into our learning cycle that everybody deserves an education, no matter who they are, where they come from, whether they have a disability, whether they have a learning difficulty, whether there are mental health issues that make learning more difficult. And that takes me into, Andy, this whole question of organizing our learning space. You know, even if we are teaching online, as you've said, you've got things growing, you've got toys, you've got puppets. I have exactly the same thing, different sizes of puppets, giant puppets, lots of different monsters and so on, but people can see me in a playful environment. And I think by seeing me, yes, I have a few books on my bookcase, but I'm not backed just by a library, which for some people can be quite scary. But other things soften that environment. And we can encourage people to think back and think, well, what toy did you have that you played with, that you told secrets to, and so on? Same principle, you did it as a child. Why not do that as an adult? I think it helps as well for those of us teaching to try and imagine the group we're teaching sitting in a circle. I know usually in conventional education, people sit in rows, in lines. Well, the best thing about people sitting in lines is they can't communicate with each other. Whereas if they sit in a circle, or if it's a big class, 2 or 3 circles, people can communicate more democratically across the circle. But I find if I imagine that in my class I'm teaching online, it helps me to behave in a more democratic way rather than an authoritarian way of teaching.
A very interesting point.
Mm,
Find another way using our imaginations to try and push
absolutely.
ourselves out of these constrained boxes that we find
Mm,
ourselves in.
mm. I
I
mean,
think it's very
the point,
look.
can I feed in quickly? I don't know whether this happens in Malaysia, but certainly in the UK, they found that certain, not just children, adults, learn better in nature than within the walls of a classroom. And they actually take groups into the woods or the forest or the fields and find that their actual learning achievement just immediately goes up, that the actual felt environment. And there's no reason why we can't teach in nature if we want to.
Yes, but why find the trees?
Yes.
But we
Okay.
laugh, but why not? You know.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
It's we've got probably about 15 minutes left, and I just wanted to touch on one of the reasons why this talk I think is interesting to a lot of people is that because of this pandemic that we find ourselves in around the world, a lot of people have been pushed into online education. They've been pushed into delivering online education, and they've been pushed into, as learners, receiving online education. A recent bit of research that I did in Malaysia, and I would suggest that it could be true all over the world, is that because of the lack of creativity and the lack of interaction that currently occurs with online education, that in the study that I did, over 60% of students felt dissatisfied and stressed with their online learning experience. And many of them were saying, oh, we're looking forward to face-to-face coming back. And lecturers likewise, oh, I can't wait to get back into the classroom and delivering face-to-face lectures again. What these people are forgetting is that, as was suggested in the title, we are now in the fourth industrial revolution. It's all about big data. It's about the internet. It's about online learning. And yes, after the pandemic, we may well be back in a space of face-to-face instruction, face-to-face learning. But online learning is going to be one of our futures. It's not going to go away. It's going to grow. It's going to be an option, however big that option is, that's going to continue. So in that respect, we need to find ways to continually innovate our online education. And I think I'm not, again, like you didn't mention the country, for this learning experience. I'm not going to mention the institution or the lecturer for this example I'm about to give, but a particular lecturer I was informed in was not only not doing any kind of face-to-face online learning with the students, but was using a WhatsApp group to write out some questions and said, right, that's your lecture for today. Go and find out what you need to find out on Google or whatever. Now, that to me is the lowest common denominator. That is lazy teaching and ultimately lazy learning. The future, I think the future for online learning is really exciting. We've got artificial intelligence. We've got augmented reality. And one of my favorites is we've got the development of holographics. Now, particularly, I'll just briefly mention this and then I'll pass back to you, Sue. Holographics. Imagine this, that you can be learning online, but still feel like you're in the same space because your hologram will be in the same space as the lecturer and some of the other students, and all of their holograms will be in your space. So you will actually feel like you're interacting because their holograms will be in the same space. So you can still talk to them and notice their body language and so on. I think that that's really exciting. And it kind of touches, doesn't it, Sue, on one of the EU projects that we were involved in, and this is going back 10 years or more, where there was a kind of immersive experience where we were going online from different countries around the world, but going into this virtual space as avatars. I'm sure everybody's seen the film Avatar. So we would physically be in our own homes or classrooms. Our avatar would be in a virtual space, meeting other people's virtual avatars, and the avatars could communicate and learn with each other. That was the start. Holographics, I think, is going to be the next big step, and is something that I'm personally very excited about.
Yes, that's absolutely fascinating, Andy, and that's where the future definitely is going. What I'd like to do for my contribution, though, is to bring it back to something that everybody could actually do now.
Yes.
The next time you're thinking of talking to another person, maybe explaining something, maybe if somebody's missed a lecture and you're going to repeat it back to them to help them along and so on, try to tell it as a story. Because a very, very interesting, very recent neuroscientific research has discovered there's a part of our brain that particularly responds to storytelling. So much so they're calling it the storytelling brain. And what happens is when we begin to tell a story and engage other people or a person in that, the actual neurons in their brains and our brains start to interact themselves. And we modify our own storytelling brain as we hear a story from somebody else. Now, that is really quite revolutionary as a teaching aid, that teaching in story form. And as we know, when the lecturer gives a personal example of something, immediately we sit up and listen more. Teaching in story form is actually a very effective way of learning, and it activates a process called neural coupling. And neural coupling is when the neurons in your brain respond to the neurons in my brain, and they modify each other. So more and more in my own work, whether it's teaching or whether it's working with disability or working as a therapist, I'm using therapeutic storytelling.
Fabulous. And I think a lot of people forget, don't they, Sue, that storytelling is really part of the natural human condition. We go through our lives telling stories to each other.
Mm.
And it is one of the great ways that we have of learning, for sure.
And I
So,
mean, I was just going to say, we say you never guess what happened to me yesterday.
yes.
And immediately we're telling a story about what happened yesterday.
Yeah.
Mm.
Right. I believe that Farah is moderating, and I
Yeah.
noticed that we've slightly gone over time. Farah, do you
Yeah.
want us to continue, or are there some questions for us to answer?
We have one question and a few opinions, but shall we go with the questions then? All right.
Fire away.
All right. So there's one question from Noor Azam asking, have you done any TPS, which means think, pair, share, during online sessions with students? And just in case you didn't know what think, pair, share was, it's a collaborative teaching strategy where students work together to solve a problem. Yeah. So have you guys done that before, TPS?
Mm. Yeah, so I think this is a wonderful approach because it's not a question of you having all the answers and learners having to either work them out or guess them. You can approach it as a joint thing, a collaborative thing, and nobody is assuming to have all the knowledge. So a voyage of discovery together, I think, is the best way of learning in that sense.
Totally agree with that, Sue. I often mention to my students, there's 30 of you, there's one of me, right? You must know more than I do if you put all your ideas and you shared with each other. And in fact, on some of the lectures or some of the classes, some of the workshops that I engage in, is part of me sort of holds back from feeding lots of facts and so on. And I try to get my learners, my participants, in a safe space where they feel comfortable sharing all of their ideas together. And it's amazing that a lot of them in the feedback afterwards have never felt that kind of comfortableness, if you like. I'm not sure if that's a word, where they are able to share their ideas, and they get to see ideas from lots of different points of view. They also get to know each other a lot better, and I think you would go along with this, Sue, is that if learners can feel that the ideas, the facts have come from within them, they're much more likely to remember them, to adopt them, and to keep them. And I think that process of learning is a lot more effective. Yes, as you said. Yeah, good question.
Yes, because at the end of the day, we sometimes lose sight of what learning is all about.
Not only that, I think for a lot of lecturers, they imagine that they not only know better than their students, they feel there's no more learning for them to engage in, and I'm sure you asked me to think of lecturers or teachers from my childhood that didn't engage. I think it's the ones that thought they knew it all and were so bored with the subject and that didn't want to learn anything new themselves that were the least inspiring of all the people that tried to teach me something.
Yes, indeed. And inspiration is a very important word here.
Inspiration, for sure.
And I mean, just remembering that to feel inspired, that the word inspiration is also a breathing word. You inspire, which means you breathe in. So breathing in helps to develop your creativity.
Links us right back to the beginning of the session when we talked about the breath being one of the most important aspects of not only our speech but also our well-being.
Absolutely.
It's a way to relax, to de-stress, to speak effectively. Yes, there's an awful lot in that. Any more questions, Farah?
Right. I actually like to add a statement that one of our viewers said. So Darshini said, I wish they could rewrite the way they teach young children in all schools and kindergartens by using nature as a tool. What do you guys think?
Well, we already know what you think, Sue. Delivering lectures using nature as a tool. Yes, I think that's a fantastic idea if that could be developed. I'm not sure all the trees would like to have sort of Wi-Fi routers planted in them, but yeah, it's an interesting concept, isn't it? That we take lessons, lectures, workshops, courses out into the forest, out into the garden, out into the park. And if we were able to effectively engage online in those spaces as well, I think that would make for some very interesting learning for sure.
And not forgetting the seaside as well.
The seaside, yeah.
Hi, Sue. This is Dashini here, just to say hi.
Oh, hello.
Hi, Andy. I like the
Hello,
idea.
Dashini.
I love the idea of going to the sea. Now that the children would come back, they would just spend the whole day by the beach. That would be the only thing.
Just think what they would learn by the beach as well.
I know. You know, Sue, that is such an excellent idea. When I was young, I lived by the beach, but my house was by the beach. And I think I had the most wonderful time with seashells. And I used to wonder what seaweed was and why the crabs were running. I mean, it's just a myriad of life that, that is just lost in today's world. It's just lost. So I hope they bring it back, and thank God for people like you and Andy who think in this way, thank God. So all the best, love.
I'd love to give a little example of this, Andy, if I may.
Please.
I was working in an Eastern European country that was recovering of the scandals of their orphanages and so on. And I got permission to take a group of carers and a group of teenage orphans to the seaside. And all the teenagers immediately rushed into the sea and splashed and had lots of fun. And the carers sat in a row on the beach with their handbags on their laps. And I said to them, the last one in the sea is a sissy. And they looked at me, threw their bags down, lifted their skirts, and ran into the sea wearing their tights even. And suddenly it broke a bubble, and they laughed and they relaxed, and their attitude just changed from that being able to go into water. And I think sometimes we need to remember we came from water, we lived for 9 months in water, and that sometimes there's a need to go back to water. There's something very, very primeval about that experience.
A lovely story.
Excellent.
Any more
Excellent.
questions, Farah, before we finish?
No, I think that's all. Would you guys like to share any last words before I close it off for everyone?
Do you want to say anything, Sue?
Well, it'd be lovely to follow up with any of you that have questions after the event. You can get in touch with me via my website, which possibly Andy could put on the screen later or something.
Yes.
Or shall I
You
say it?
just want to say what it is now, and I'll
Yes.
either myself or Farah will write it in the comments.
Okay, www.ndpltd.org. That's ndpltd.org. And you can see how I use my own work on that website, but you can also ask me questions through it.
Fabulous. And like myself, Prof. Sue will always respond to email questions.
Yes.
It doesn't cost anything apart from our time, and we're happy to give our time. If you're happy to take the time in asking a question, then we will take the time in responding to you and answering it as well. The same is true for me. Farah, if you could put my email address in the comments. I'm also happy to take any questions from anybody about anything we've talked about today or anything related to it as well. I would like to thank you and also just to say to everybody, actually, this is Sue, I'm not sure if I mentioned it in the beginning, is my mother. So we've got a lot in common apart from many miles separating us at the moment.
Darshini's got a question, I think.
Yeah.
Okay.
Do you think, thanks, Andy, thanks, Sue. I just want to say, do you think that this idea of interacting with nature and bringing children to, to places where they can have better interactions, do you think that this is being implemented more, in today's curriculum for children in early childhood education all over the world? Do you think that people are going back to nature, Sue? Do you see it?
I think there is a beginning, and what is very interesting is that traditionally the therapists used to say you can't do therapy in nature, it's distracting and so on. Now there's a whole movement of doing play therapy in nature, and nature's seen as a therapeutic experience as well as an educational one. So I think we're moving that way.
Thanks, Darshini.
Thanks, Sue. Thanks so much,
Thank
Dr.
you,
Andy.
Sue, or Mum, as I call you, away from the away from sessions. I would like to thank everybody for joining us today. I hope we've stimulated your imaginations. I hope you're able to give us some ideas about online learning, and I hope you're able to develop your online learning further. Thank you very much, and we're now going to pass back to the moderators and say goodbye. Goodbye.
Bye, and thank you for attending. Bye.
Thank you,
Thank
Sue.
you,
Thanks,
Dr.
Dr.
Sue.
Andy.
Thank you, Dr. Andy. And thank you, everyone, for joining this session of Help You Forum. What a wholesome and heartwarming conversation it was, right, everyone? Right. So, since we're done with this session, I'd like to remind everyone that you can also check out Professor Dr. Sue's work at www.ndpltd.org. I repeat, www.ndpltd.org. You can also email Dr. Andy on his email, andy.hickson@help.edu.my. Right. Yin Yin, would you like to take over?
Hi, thank you